I've got some actual good news, and that is that the Insurrection, I hope you get the quotation marks if you're listening, the case against Donald Trump has been dismissed. And I was going to talk a little bit about this, as well as just talking about the event itself, because I imagine that this is going to play a far less significant role in political discourse, because my opinion was that a mountain was made out of a molehill for political reasons, and those political reasons were to try and hamper Donald Trump's ascent to power, and it's too late for that. And so I think that I imagine this is going to go away. And so let's talk a little bit about the case first, because that's the new thing. So the judge, Tanya Chutkan, I imagine that's how you pronounce her name, dismissed the case, and the case was formally for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. And this dismissal follows Special Counsel Jack Smith's request to drop the charges at the federal level, and that is because, of course, he's going to be inaugurated in January, and the DOJ has a very old policy of not prosecuting sitting presidents because it looks bad. And they'll also drop the fight to reinstate the classified document charges as well. You remember that? The Mar-a-Lago documents, and of course Biden had the same thing where he had lots of documents in his garage, I think, or where he had his car parked. And so that's been dropped, and there's not necessarily any evidence that that's going to be reinstated again. And so this was previously dismissed by a Florida-based federal judge, and then they were pushing to get it up, to reinstate the case again, but they're not going to do that. And it's also been left open as a possibility that once Trump leaves office in 2029, he no longer has presidential immunity, and so this insurrection case, I keep on using that word, although it's not formally used in the charges, will potentially come back again, which, to be honest, this is my opinion here, I don't think that they're going to go for that, because by that point it's sort of old news politically. No one's going to have the political will to pursue it, and also Trump's political career will be over by then, so his threat will be diminished because he'll be so old that he'll be probably putting his feet up, I imagine, or at least not taking a primary role as, say, the president, because he won't be able to.
I think that basically this is one of those cases that will reopen. My guess is that it will reopen.
So,
I think it's too good for the Democrats not to do it, not to take that opportunity, because it seems to me that this is one of those cases where history is written by the victor, and anytime any kind of party wins elections, it's going to revisit. Anytime the Democrats win elections, they're going to revisit it, even if it's after Trump, because he's old now. I think they will always have this weapon against Republicans saying you subverted the constitutional order in their framework. So I don't think they're gonna. I think they'll revisit it at some point.
It is possible, and of course I don't know the future, and it was just sort of a gut feeling of they're doing this for political reasons, and therefore as soon as it's expedient they won't be interested anymore. What do you think, Bo?
I mean, who knows? I suspect they probably won't. This is like their one chance to try and get him on that, and it's essentially failed. And the DOJ obviously will be headed by Trump picks from January onwards. But then, talk about 2029. After that, assuming the Democrats get back in 29, would they then change out all the people, which they would do, of course, and then reopen this? I don't know. I think they might use it as a cudgel just in terms of rhetoric forever. But actually bringing charges against Trump, who cannot be president again, I doubt that. But who knows? I wouldn't put it past them. Because it would be pure vindictiveness at that point, wouldn't it? To try and destroy Trump after his political career is over.
I suppose if his legacy is a J.D. Vance potential presidency, and his legacy is also Jan 6th in their mind, conflating the two together, even though J.D. Vance didn't have anything to do with it, might be helpful from a rhetorical standpoint. So there could be an incentive to do that.
I think they'll use it. It'll go down in American history as a talking point on the left. of that time Trump tried to destroy democracy or whatever. Yeah,
Just not
yeah.
very
They'll
hard.
never ever stop saying stuff like that.
Trump took the most armed populace in human history and called them all unarmed to a talk. But we'll be talking about the true nature of it, don't worry. We did a lot of exclusive work at Lotus Eaters on that sort of stuff. But let's hear from the man himself, shall we?
It was a mass trespass event is what it was, not an insurrection, a trespass event.
Mm-hmm.
Trump explicitly told them not to trespass, and then they did trespass.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an insurrection, but they'll keep calling it that.
Because
They just will. Yeah.
So Trump says, these cases, like all of the other cases I've been forced to go through, are empty and lawless and should never have been brought. Over $100 million of taxpayer dollars has been wasted in the Democrat Party's fight against their political opponent, me. Nothing like this has ever happened in our country before. They've also used state prosecutors and district attorneys such as Fani Willis and her lover, Nathan Wade, who had absolutely zero experience in cases such as this, but was paid millions, enough for them to take numerous trips and cruises around the globe. I love how he kept that in. Letitia James, who inappropriately, unethically, and probably illegally campaigned on getting Trump in order to win political office, and Alvin Bragg, who himself never wanted to bring this case against me, but was forced to do so by the Justice Department and the Democratic Party. It was a political hijacking and a low point in the history of our country that such a thing could have happened, and yet I persevered against all odds and won Make America Great Again. Now that is a good way to end it, isn't it? He's got a good way with words, whatever you say about the man. So it's worth mentioning as well, once Trump does become president, if you want daily updates on what he's up to, we've got a new channel. It's doing relatively well so far. We're trying to post to it every day, just short clips. You know, if you want your news on the shorter side and you want to, you know, perhaps fill in some of the cracks that we miss out on our main podcast, which you're watching right now, then this is the place to go. So let's actually talk about the nature of January 6th, shall we? So one of the things that we did, and one of the things I'm very proud of, is if you remember back to the early days, the Hugo days, we worked together on this Capitol Hill takeover timeline because we didn't want to call it a riot or an insurrection. Takeover seemed fair enough, right? And the things I wanted to draw attention to are these earlier times here, because we've got these down to the minute. So at 17 minutes past 12, Trump calls on his supporters to march to the Capitol for the first time in his speech. Some of them leave the ellipse straight away to walk towards the Capitol. You know, he's not said to do anything, he just said to go there. By 12:53 p.m, some Trump supporters breached the outer barricade at the Capitol 20 minutes before his speech at the ellipse actually ends. So Trump is still speaking when this sort of stuff goes on. Kind of hard to suggest he's directing it when he's still giving a speech and people are ignoring his speech and doing things that he has not told them to do. And then 10 past 1 p.m, protesters at the Capitol start clashing with the police directly and trying to enter the building. And of course, this is a few minutes before Trump's speech has actually ended again. So it's pretty clear that this is something that happened without Trump and his assent, isn't it? And in fact, when it did happen, Trump put this video out on Twitter, previously not owned by Elon Musk, and so this was removed. And in fact, lots of other outlets removed this video where he's saying, don't be violent, be peaceful, go home. And he's basically saying, I know you're angry, I understand it, but don't do this. And it got to the point where Facebook indefinitely suspended Donald Trump, as did loads of platforms simultaneously, which when lots of things happen at the same time, it kind of indicates a common origin of those things. My guess would be the intelligence services. And in fact, there is evidence of that. And it's to the point where even posting the voice of Donald Trump was banned on Facebook for a time. Bit difficult to do that now. But let's not forget that we went through this period of time. And when Elon actually took over Twitter, now X of course, he claimed that there was evidence that the FBI had paid Twitter to censor information from the public. And so there is a clear link here between the intelligence services and social media censorship. And we're going to be looking at some of the claims of the fact that January 6th was some sort of trap from the intelligence services, mainly the FBI. And so if you could say incite some trouble, and then any attempts to calm people's demeanour from the people you're trying to trap get censored immediately in a pre-planned way, that would be a pretty compelling way to have some dirt on your political opponent when previously you'd been through, 5 years of trying to dig up stuff on Trump, and none of it had stuck. And so perhaps there were people who had been pushing for this sort of thing that got fed up of trying to look at his actual life and tried to make something up. That's just an idea. I'm not saying that is definitely true, but it is entirely possible. And it's also worth mentioning as well that we had a bunch of exclusive photos. There's some photos here from January 5th as well. People forget there was a day before that was perfectly peaceful. And there are lots of signs showing the kind of rhetoric. It was your usual political stuff, lots of people who are patriotic, coming out and basically supporting their political candidate. I mean, there are some great photos here. But one of the things, for example, like they were outside tying nooses for elected politicians. I'd like to point out that if you were to use this noose, which is not a functional noose, they would have to be about 2 foot tall. So any, dwarf representatives would have been in danger. But, it was a mountain out of a molehill. And then you can see the sort of intel people up the top, and you can start to see some of the violence, because the photographer that we were in correspondence with was at the rear entrance, videoing a lot of the, and taking pictures of a lot of the violence at the back here, which was not the main event. It was interesting that this was what happened. And so you can see here some of the Capitol Police protecting this doorway. There they are, look. And you can see that people are just using things like American flags and chairs and all sorts of improvised weapons. And then eventually people get smoked out, and then they all leave. But what people don't mention as well is at this rear entrance, half of the people there are there with cameras recording it. And so the number of people involved does get inflated, because actually journalists and photographers were massively overrepresented, and you can see it to some extent with certain things. You can also see here people getting pepper sprayed. That's a pretty good shot. But yeah, there's people using crutches and things like that. This is not a very organised armed uprising. That much is obvious, and I feel like that claim doesn't need to be taken too seriously, really, does it?
Clutches are not the favorite weapon of Republicans. I get the impression it's not.
So I wanted to talk about the notion of potential federal government involvement, particularly the FBI. And I think it's entirely possible that there was involvement in inciting this. And there are lots of suspicious links. I've already addressed the social media ones, but there are also links to informants in specific groups that are linked to inciting things whilst they're an FBI informant. And I imagine if you're an FBI informant, you probably wouldn't want to be genuinely inciting violence, because they're keeping tabs on you, right? And they're keeping tabs on you, so why would you do something that is, is against the law? I don't buy that they're just doing this of their own volition. And unfortunately, there's no irrefutable evidence that I've seen so far, but there is, I think, a strong case. And it's also worth mentioning as well that US lawmakers can see information that we're not allowed to see as, members of the public, and I'm not even a US citizen, so even less likely for me to be able to see it. So what we do know for certain, though, is the FBI had informants within groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and that a member of the Proud Boys texted his FBI handler during the event itself. We know those for certain, which is, perhaps a small sliver of a greater picture, because there's no doubt more to it than that. That's just what we've been able to find out for certain. And that comes from, of all the publications, the New York Times. They had an exclusive about this all the way back on the 25th of September 2021. And one of the names that gets thrown around is Ray Epps. I'm sure you've probably both heard of him before. And I'm going to read a little bit about what the BBC says about him, because this is a pretty good summary of why people think he might be a Fed. In footage from the night before the riot, he was seen urging people to enter the Capitol building. Members of the crowd were suspicious and chanted back, "Fed, Fed," accusing him of being a law enforcement official. I mean, fair enough. The following day, during the riot itself, Epps was seen on another video whispering into the ear of a man who then charged at police lines. Epps later said he unsuccessfully tried to calm the man down. Of course, that's what it was. It's also worth mentioning as well, whilst lots of people got considerable prison time, he got 100 hours community service. It's funny that, isn't it? For someone who's caught on camera inciting it, he's done a lot more than some of the people that are still in jail right now. Strange, isn't it?
Suspicious minds are talking.
It is, yeah. It's a case of that. It's also worth mentioning as well, there was a case in September of 2023 where Thomas Massie was talking to Merrick Garland over January 6th informants, and he basically asked him a series of questions that I'm going to fire through very quickly, but he basically asked him about his knowledge of federal law enforcement activities during Jan 6th, and I'm going to directly quote here. That was your answer to a question to me 2 years ago when I said how many agents or assets the government were present on January 5th and 6th, agitating in the crowd to go into the Capitol, and how many went into the Capitol. Can you answer that now? And he says, I don't know the answer to that question. You don't know how many there were, or were there none? And he says, I don't know the answer to either of those questions. If there were any, I don't know how many. I don't know if there were any. And it carries on and on and on. And he's basically saying that you've had 2 years to find out. By the way, this was in reference to Ray Epps, and yesterday you indicted him. Isn't that a wonderful coincidence? On a misdemeanor. Meanwhile, you're sending grandmas to prison. You're putting people away for 20 years for merely filming. Some people weren't even there. You've got the guy on video who's saying, go into the Capitol. He's directing people to the Capitol before the speeches. Massie continues. And he says, he's at the site of the first breach. You've got all the goods on him, 10 videos, and it's an indictment for a misdemeanor. The American public isn't buying it. And also, there are other people as well. So this is Representative Clay Higgins. I think he's for Louisiana. He says the FBI, their involvement was deep, and not just on Jan 6, but in the days and weeks prior. They're not only involved in the actions on Jan 6 from within, they had over 200 agents embedded, dressed as Trump supporters before the doors were open. And I'm not sure where he's getting that 200 agent thing, but that might be information that's only available to them.
If that is true, and I've got no idea, but if that is true, if that's even close to being true, that's an astounding number.
Mm-hmm.
If it was 12, that would be quite a lot. 200? Really?
Interesting.
That's
isn't it?
sort of madness if that is true.
And the funny thing is that...
Do they count Nick Fuentes in that number?
I don't know, possibly. A quarter of Americans believe that the FBI orchestrated it, actually. And again, another quarter of Republicans think that it was justified, which... no comment. But anyway...
I mean, if you look at it from a democratic politics perspective, if you think that there has actually been fraud, you have to somehow protest.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the means that are used are of paramount importance, but a lot of Democrats are trying to present this as a massive anti-democracy event, and I'm talking about the gathering, not the people who trespassed, the few who trespassed. They are doing this only from within their own framework.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also, on the topic of framework, I think in 2020, if we cast our minds back, the sort of atmosphere of American politics was fiery, to say the least. Obviously, you had all the Floyd riots, where cities were burnt to the ground, And so I think what happened in a lot of people's minds was, well, okay, if these are the standards, we're not going to go quite that far, but we're going to make a bit of a fuss because apparently this is okay now. And the problem of people assuming that would be that, yeah, there's a double standard, obviously, and there was always going to be one. And it's worth mentioning as well, the people who turned up weren't, these extremist revolutionaries. We did a huge piece looking at each individual person, lots of the people that were arrested and the information on them and what they did, their backgrounds, who they are, things like that. So you can find out who these people are and judge them for yourself. I've also spoke to Edward Jacob Lang while he was in prison for his involvement in January 6th. And in fact, at one point, he was the prisoner facing the most charges out of any prisoner. But he's very interesting to talk to, very interesting guy, and definitely worth listening to. And I had a follow-up with him in 2023 as well, asking how he's doing. And I think he's still holding out for a Trump pardon when he assumes office. But he's never given up hope. And I suppose what I wanted to end on is that we shouldn't necessarily forget the nature of this event, because it exposed a lot of things that I think otherwise wouldn't have been exposed. There was a lot of attention on it, but the attention's focused on criticising Trump, when actually I think a lot of the interesting things is just how much the intelligence agencies interfered with US politics there, because they have their fingerprints all over every aspect of it. There's not one where I think, okay, they had nothing to do with that. And so that, I think, is the takeaway for the right, really, because the left set the precedent for this sort of thing, and the right followed up on it. And I don't necessarily think it achieved anything politically, and therefore I don't think it was a good idea. I don't support it like those quarter of Republicans do. However, there are lots of lessons to be learnt from this, and I hope that people do learn this going into a Trump presidency.
I think just in the scheme of things across history, it was very minor, but it's not nothing though.
Mm-hmm.
Like we on our side of the equation try and either underplay it or try and describe it in just purely factual terms. It wasn't nothing, but in the scheme of things, compared to the mob marching on the Tuileries or the Roman mob burning down the Senate House in ancient Rome or something, it's sort of nothing. It was very, very civilized and quaint almost, this trespass event. At most, I would call it disquieting. At most, it's like, oh yeah, people could just overpower the cops, whether it's an inside job or whatever. They could just walk into the middle of the Capitol building. That is a bit disquieting. But in terms of it being an actual insurrection, actual perversion of democracy, or a perversion of the Republic or the Constitution or anything like that, no, of course not. I wrote an article, I think I called it something like Kamala Harris's fever dream, or, it was more like, I said the Democrats' Reichstag fire. They were trying to use it as like a Reichstag fire type,
good historic example there.
Type thing. And it's just the evidence, the facts are just not there. It was an ad hoc thing by some kind of silly trespassers.
I hope you appreciate that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can always follow our series Lads Hour, this one about fixing every country. It's a good bit of fun. If you want to see all the other things we're putting out, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.